Constantinople, 797 CE. A single line sits in an imperial succession register. Konstantinos VI, Emperor, reigning. 17 days later, the same hand draws a line through it in red. The ink is steady, unhurried. Konstantinos is still alive when the pen lifts from the page, breathing, eating, speaking his own name to the monks who will now house him. The church has countersigned the order. The entry does not record a death. It records something the Byzantines had spent centuries perfecting. The church signed it too. The Byzantine Empire ran on paper, not swords paper. By the 9th century, Constantinople operated one of the most sophisticated administrative states anywhere on earth. Layered ministries, imperial registrars, palace notaries, a succession apparatus that tracked every living male claimant to the throne with the precision of a tax census. Names, titles, physical condition, political status, all logged, cross-referenced, and filed. When an emperor fell, through coup, through a brother's ambition, through a mother who calculated the numbers and decided he was the weaker bet, the state did not simply kill him. Killing was crude. Killing left bodies. Bodies became martyrs. Martyrs became rallying cries. Widowed has, since you were murdered. Emperors had a habit of reappearing a decade later with armies behind them. The Byzantines had looked at this problem and solved it the way they solved most problems, with paperwork and theology working in perfect alignment. They had built a legal category for a man who was alive, but officially nowhere. If you've never heard Byzantine political violence described as an administrative process, stay with this. There's worse underneath. Tonsure, forced monastic vows, stripped a man of secular identity. He could not rule. The monastery received him. Typhlosis, blinding, made him ritually ineligible for the throne. Imperial rule required physical wholeness. A man without eyes was, by law, no longer a candidate for anything. Rhinotomia, the removal of the nose, achieved the same legal result through a different instrument. None of these carried an official designation as punishment. Not one. Every surviving document from the Byzantine Imperial Archive classifies them identically. Acts of imperial philanthropia. Mercy. The emperor, in his boundless compassion, had chosen to preserve his rival's life. The state kept the rival breathing. The church recorded his spiritual elevation to monastic life. And a notary, a mid-ranking palace scribe with ink-stained fingers and a very particular job, drew a single red line through the name in the register. Consider what that line actually was. Not a death record, not a criminal sentence, a bureaucratic reclassification. The man existed on the other side of it. Still ate, still prayed, still dreamed. He simply no longer existed inside the column that mattered, and the man holding the pen was not a torturer or a tyrant's blade man. He was an administrator. He had learned the correct form of the red line from his predecessor, who had learned it from his. He drew it left to right, always left to right, a formality preserved across centuries, one clerk to the next, like a secret no one thought to classify as a secret. The church called it mercy. What did the victims call it? Michael Psellos was not a soldier. He was a philosopher, a courtier, a man who, since you were 17, a man who spent his career inside the palace watching emperors rise and fall with the studied detachment of someone who understood that observation was the safest position available. He wrote 11 books about Byzantine court life. He watched 3 emperors deposed, and in his Chronographia, composed from the inside by a man who was present, he describes the blinding of Michael V caliphates in 1042 CE with a specificity that takes a moment to fully register. Psellos does not call it horror. He calls it the necessary resolution of a constitutional difficulty. That phrase is the real subject of this documentary, not the blinding, not the blood, the phrase. The Byzantines had built an entire vocabulary of administrative erasure, precise, technical, theologically grounded terminology that converted mutilation into procedure and procedure into an act of love. Philanthropia, imperial love for one's subjects, was the formal justification inscribed in blinding orders. The same word appears in the Gospel of Luke, the same ink, the same hand that copied scripture on Sunday morning could sign a blinding order on Monday and experience no contradiction, because the language had been engineered to prevent contradiction. Somewhere in what remains of the Imperial Archive, there is a document listing 6 men processed in a single administrative session. 6 names, 6 red lines. 1 word in the margin, written once and then repeated 5 more times. Philanthropia. Philanthropia, philanthropia. The notary who wrote it did not pause between entries. He was not a monster. He was efficient. Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, emperor, scholar, the man who compiled the De Ceremoniis, the great ceremonial manual of Byzantine court life. codified in writing the exact physical requirements for imperial rule. The emperor must be holokleros, whole, complete, unblemished in body. This was not poetic language. This was legal statute carrying the same administrative weight as a property deed or a tax assessment. And Constantine VII knew what he was writing. He had spent years as a marginalized co-emperor, technically reigning, functionally sidelined, close enough to the register to understand exactly what a red line meant. The succession register was not simply a list of names. It was a list of certified bodies. Every name in the active claimants column represented a man whose physical wholeness had been implicitly verified by the palace official responsible for exactly that function, the protospatharios, whose role appears consistently across Byzantine court records, spanning multiple dynasties. He examined, he certified, he reported upward, the notary recorded the result. The register reflected reality, and reality could be altered. Bardas Phokas the Elder learned this in the 960s CE, after his failed rebellion against Nikephoros X. He was blinded. He spent the next 30 years alive and eyeless in a monastery outside Constantinople. His prayers were recorded by monastic scribes. That much survives. He never used the word philanthropia. Not once in 30 years of documented prayer does he describe what was done to him as mercy. That is a quiet fact. It does not announce itself, but it sits there in the record, patient and immovable. In 1042, Michael V Caliphates had 6 hours between sentencing and the blade. The paperwork was already complete. Here is what the history books do not tell you. The Byzantine Empire did not need to kill its rivals. Not because it lacked the capacity. Constantinople had executioners, it had dungeons, it had poisons refined to a precision that Roman chemists would have admired. It chose not to use them, because death had a problem that no emperor had ever solved. Death was reversible, not physically, theologically. A murdered emperor became a martyr. Martyrs accumulated prayers, and prayers accumulated followers. And followers had a way of becoming armies in the hands of the right widow or the right ambitious general. The Byzantines had thought carefully about this, across generations, and arrived at something more permanent, administrative non-existence. When the notary drew his red line through a name, he was not recording what had happened to a man. He was performing a legal act that determined what that man could ever be again. The blinding order was the physical mechanism. Brutal, yes, but secondary. The register entry was the verdict. The man on the other side of that red line continued to exist as a body requiring bread, as a monk requiring liturgy, as a soul requiring salvation. The church handled that. The state handled the column, and neither institution experienced the slightest difficulty reconciling its role, because philanthropia covered both. The mercy of preserving life, the mercy of removing a threat. One word, no contradiction permitted. A single administrative session in 1042 CE produced 6 crossed names in a single afternoon. 6 living men who went to sleep that night, legally nowhere. Not dead, not imprisoned, not sentenced, simply reclassified into a category the register had always maintained space for. The notary dipped his pen 6 times. He went home. He had dinner. He was not a monster. That is the point. He was a man who had been trained by another man, who had been trained by another man before him, stretching back through generations of palace administration to a moment when some predecessor had first decided that the red line was the solution. He believed in the system. He believed in philanthropia. The horror does not live in individual cruelty. It lives in the institutional sincerity of men who were absolutely certain they were doing something humane. If every emperor knew this could be done to him, why did any of them trust the paperwork? Patriarch of Constantinople was not a passive observer. He was a co-signatory. Byzantine canon law, inherited and reshaped from Roman administrative tradition across centuries, embedded the church's role in imperial succession at a constitutional level. When an emperor was subjected to tonsure, the patriarch presided. When a blinded rival was sent to a monastery, that monastery fell under church jurisdiction. The church was, in the most precise administrative sense, the receiving institution for the state's surplus claimants. It processed them, it housed them, it recorded their prayers. Patriarch Photios, I understood this from both directions. In the 9th century, he was twice deposed and twice restored, his own name crossed out and reinstated in the register, twice, by different emperors, with different political calculations. He wrote extensively on philanthropia. His theological arguments for sparing rivals' lives while removing their political existence are careful, sophisticated, and entirely sincere. He was not constructing a cover story. He believed every word. He had also watched his own name disappear from the register and reappear, and he went on writing theology throughout. Photios himself wrote the mercy doctrine. Photios himself was blinded. He kept writing, "The notary has a name we will not know." That is not a dramatic device. That is simply how the archive works. The men who maintained the registers were not the kind of men whose names got recorded. Emperors got names. Patriarchs got names. The person who actually held the pen, who dipped it and drew the line that ended a political life. He got a job title and a salary notation, and if he was fortunate, a brief mention in a probate record when he died. We know his function. We know his training. We know, from Byzantine administrative manuals that circulated among palace officials, the exact protocol he followed. The red line drawn left to right, never right to left. The word philanthropia placed in the left margin at a precise vertical alignment with the crossed name. These instructions were written down, copied, transmitted. The knowledge moved from one generation of notaries to the next, like a trade secret that had stopped being a secret because everyone already knew it. He had trained under a senior registrar. A man who had taken him on at 14, shown him the angle of the pen, corrected his margins, and explained, without apparent discomfort, the weight of what a correctly executed register entry accomplished. The senior registrar was now 72. He had retired to a monastery on the Bosphorus. He was there voluntarily. He had served his function, drawn his lines, written his philanthropias, and stepped quietly into the institution that had always been the final destination of the register's subjects. There was something almost symmetrical about it, though the notary had never said so aloud. 3 weeks ago, a new emperor had sent an order. A letter had been opened. Not the old man's letter. A letter about the old man, covered from the correspondence of a deposed claimant, referencing a communication from the senior registrar that was, at minimum, imprudent, possibly innocent. The new emperor did not require it to be treasonous, and inconvenience had a very specific administrative solution. The order did not go to an executioner. It went to the notary. It required him to enter his former teacher's name into a secondary register, not the imperial succession list, which tracked active claimants to the throne, but the watch register, a parallel administrative document that flagged individuals deemed operationally problematic to the current reign. Byzantine records confirm the existence of multiple register tiers, succession registers, watch registers, monastic placement registers, each carrying different consequences, each maintained by the same office, the same pen, the same left-to-right red line. The watch register was not a death warrant. It was something the notary understood far more precisely than any executioner could. He read the order. He set it on the desk. He looked at the pen. His hand did not shake. He had been trained too well for that. The shake, if there was one, was somewhere the register could not record. Somewhere in the gap between the man he had been at 14, correcting his margins under the old man's patient instruction, and the man he was now, sitting alone in the registry office with an order that had his teacher's name written at the top of it. He dipped the pen across the water in a monastery on the Bosphorus. An old man was completing the morning liturgy. He did not know the letter had been opened. He did not know that somewhere in the palace, a pen was moving across a page with his name on it. He knew the prayers. He had always known the prayers. He said them now, in the quiet of a stone chapel, while the Bosphorus moved outside the window and the ink dried on the register entry that had just reclassified him. He did not feel it happen. That was the point. That had always been the point. From Justinian in the 6th century to the Palaiologoi in the 15th, the register never closed. Historians have catalogued, conservatively, over 50 emperors or senior co-emperors processed through these administrative mechanisms across Byzantine history. The actual number of lesser claimants, brothers, cousin, rival generals, inconvenient nephews, runs into the hundreds. Not one official document from the imperial archive designates any of it as punishment. Not one. Every surviving record uses the language of restraint and compassion. The red lines accumulate across the centuries, not like a chronicle of violence, but like a ledger of municipal decisions. Drainage works, grain allocations, surplus claimants reclassified. The handwriting changes. The formula does not. Macedonian dynasty, Komnenian dynasty, Paleologian dynasty, different centuries, different thrones, same left margin, same word, philanthropia, philanthropia, philanthropia. Someone in each generation taught the next notary the correct angle of the line. The knowledge was not improvised. It was transmitted, deliberately, through the administrative manuals that circulated among palace officials, documents that included specific instructions for recording the status changes of imperial rivals alongside instructions for tax collection and ceremonial seating arrangements. The blinding of a co-emperor and the organization of a state banquet occupied adjacent sections of the same administrative handbook. Neither was treated as extraordinary. Both required correct procedure. This is the part that takes a moment to absorb. Not the violence, the normalcy of the paperwork surrounding it. By 1453, when Ottoman forces breached the Theodosian walls after a 53-day siege, most of the imperial archive burned or scattered. 50,000 soldiers moving through a city generate a particular kind of documentary chaos. But fragments survived, copied into ecclesiastical chronicles, embedded in monastic records, carried out by monks who understood that certain texts needed to outlast the institutions that produced them. Among what endures, the De Ceremoniis of Constantine VII, with its meticulous protocols for the reception of neutralized rivals into imperial monastic custody. Among what endures, Psellos' Chronographia, a philosopher's clinical account of 3 depositions witnessed from inside the palace, written with the measured detachment of a man who had fully processed the bureaucratic reality of what he was describing. Among what endures, fragments of register notation, formulaic and consistent, spanning centuries of crossed names and left margin annotations in ink that archivists describe as remarkably well preserved. Modern Byzantine scholars have identified at least 28 emperors or co-emperors blinded during the single period between 695 and 1185 CE. In that same span, fewer than 12 Byzantine rulers died in battle. The register was a more reliable instrument of political termination than any army the empire ever fielded. It required less logistics. It left no battlefield. It generated paperwork instead of corpses. And paperwork, as the Byzantines had understood from the beginning, was far easier to file than a martyr. When Constantinople fell, the last entries in some watch registers were still unsigned. Someone had walked away mid-page. The empire ended not with a completed document, but with a pen set down and a name left hanging, neither crossed nor restored, simply frozen at the moment the institution that gave the red line its meaning ceased to exist. If the last notary walked away from an unsigned register, who was supposed to cross that final name? We do not speak about the paperwork. That is how history buried this. When we talk about Byzantine violence, we reach for the spectacular, the conspiracies, the poisonings, the blinding of Empress Irene's own son. Those stories have drama, they have villains, they satisfy the part of us that wants cruelty to wear a recognizable face. The administrative record is harder to look at precisely because it wears no face at all. It is columns and ink, and a word repeated so many times across so many centuries that it stopped meaning anything, or started meaning everything, depending on how long you sit with it. Philanthropia, love of humanity. The word passed from Byzantine theological tradition into medieval Latin, into Western European ecclesiastical language, and eventually into English. Philanthropy, the act of charitable giving, the love of one's fellow human beings expressed through generosity and care. Every time that word is used today, it is carrying 6 centuries of margin annotations on its back. That is not a metaphor. That is etymology. The word that Byzantine notaries wrote, beside crossed-out names of men whose eyes had been removed by official order, is the same word now engraved on hospital wings and university buildings and charitable foundations across the world. The language survived. The men whose names it covered did not, or survived only as bodies in monasteries, saying prayers they had memorized before the register reclassified them. Outliving emperors they would never know had already fallen. There was a monk, somewhere outside Constantinople, in the 12th century. He had been brought to the monastery 40 years before. His name had been in the register. It had been crossed out in red. He had outlived, by the rough calculation of historians, who have pieced together what fragments remain, at least 3 emperors. He did not know this. He knew the liturgy. He knew the sequence of the morning prayers, the smell of the chapel in winter, particular quality of light through the eastern window at the 3rd hour. He did not know that in a palace archive he would never see again, his name was still there, ink faded but legible, one red line drawn through it, philanthropia in the left margin, patient and permanent. He said his prayers. The archive kept its record. Neither knew the other still existed. The Byzantine Empire perfected the erasure of living men and buried the method inside a word that the world went on use for 1,000 years without knowing what it had once been asked to cover. that word is still in circulation. The red lines are still legible in the fragments that survived the fire. And the institution that inherited Byzantium's administrative logic, its appetite for neutralizing rivals through paperwork, through reclassification, through the bureaucrat grace of a system that called control by the name of mercy, did not die with Constantinople. It put on a different uniform. It moved to a different city. It kept the pen. The empire that absorbed Byzantium's methods didn't call it philanthropia. It had its own word, its own register, and 6 centuries of practice refining what Constantinople started.